All right, I'll call the January 21st DRB meeting to order. First is agenda changes. None. If everybody can review the minutes of January 7th.
I have a question on page 2 where Bill, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 paragraphs down, says Bill B said he'd like to stop the water coming off the roof into his backyard. Semicolon, destroying the building would only benefit him. I thought it was improving the building would only benefit him, but maybe I misunderstood him. I didn't think he was talking about destroying the building.
I wasn't here.
I think he was talking about improving. What?
I wasn't here.
Oh. Anybody else?
Guess I don't.
I think it's improving. I think it's improving. That's my recollection of that discussion.
It does kind of make more sense.
Yeah. That's the only thing I had.
Well, if the building weren't there, then it would be improved.
Yeah, well, there's that.
Unless it's better. But I think you're right.
Yeah. Okay. So I move to approve as amended.
I'll second
All those in favor?
Aye.
that. Aye.
Abstain? All right, up next is John and Sandra Milbank and Robert Stahl, Subdivision Revision. How you doing?
Doing well. Is that it? You wanna?
Describe basically what you're.
Oh, well, usually, I'm not sure. It depends. I do go to so many meetings in so many towns. Sometimes Mitch might explain the project to you and then we comment.
Yeah, I'm being lazy here. I did that in my report.
All right.
Yeah, he'd write a report for us.
So can you,
Well,
why are you doing this?
first of all, my
What's your
name's
point?
Jack Milbank, and this is my partner in ownership of Lot 2, Bob Stahl.
Okay.
And we decided to, the Lot 2 became available for sale, was put on the market maybe a couple of years ago, and hadn't had a lot of activity, or hadn't had much.
As a 30-acre lot.
The 30-acre lot, there hadn't been much interest, or it was, the price point wasn't right. But last fall, there was some interest. We explained to the realtor if something developed, we'd like to have the chance to put an offer on it. And it was important to us for a couple of reasons. One, it's undeveloped. My lot, I own Lot 3 with my wife. Bob has Lot 2. The original layout of the subdivision that was done by the estate of Ruth Williams Bishop needed to provide, as part of the will, a 30-acre lot for a relative. And so that lot was inherited by a woman named Carolee Berg, and who was out of state and really had no interest in, she just kind of held on to it. So Bob and I thought it might be an opportunity to buy it and maybe protect our interest, give us, there were no building envelopes on the lot. That afforded us a little opportunity to sort of protect our space up there.
But I mean, there's still gonna be a house built up there, probably, in the future.
Someday, no immediate plans for a house. So anyway, the thought was that we'd split the lot, and geometrically, the polygon made sense. We sort of divided it so that we sort of, the Milbanks would retain the north half of Lot 2, and Bob would retain the south lot. We would adjust that into his piece, and we'd retain Lot 2 as a building lot, because it was already approved as a building lot. And so that's how we we decided to buy it. We're dividing it. We're gonna, the nice thing about the adjustment from Bob's standpoint is that there's a nice meadow down low as you come off of Bishop Road, and he knows that there won't be a house right in his view shed or right in his front yard. Judy Fritz's lot, which was just south, had been subdivided a few years ago, and that house was nicely sited so that it, at least in the summer months, he's got view protection from it. And it just seemed to make sense. It seems to make most sense that we would be good people to buy the land. So we did. And so now we're here so that we can divide it.
So is Judy's property right on the north side of Texas Hill?
Judy Fritz's?
Yeah.
Yes. Oh, she's gone now, but
And George Bedard's is
George is on the south
then,
side,
yeah.
correct? Yeah,
Now I remember this place.
yeah, yes. And anyway, just a little history of the lot, and well, you don't need much more, but basically, the lot had been for sale. It would have required, things have changed in the state wastewater and water supply rules. The lot was no longer exempt. It would have needed a state permit for no matter who bought it. No matter who bought it. 2007 was a clean slate. 2003 was a significant change in the regulations where they allowed innovative and alternative systems. They changed the prescriptive requirements. They let the water table come up. In 2007, they realized they had some issues, so trying to manage pre-existing non-conformances, everything, they decided to do a clean slate. And basically, in 2007, what you had is your starting point for permitting. So these lots, these were over 10 acres, were exempt when Ruth Williams Bishop did this, but that lost that exemption. So there would have to be a state wastewater and water supply. I know it's part of the comments. It would have needed one anyway, and it's still going to require one now.
Okay.
And in terms of, I saw a little thing in the staff report about well location. We identified soils on the survey only to, for two reasons. Number one, if we don't, those were designed wastewater systems by our firm in 1997. They had soils that had the right distance of lead, or for now they had the 24 inches for water table. Anyway, it's very conservative now. Now there's much more flexibility in design. But we need to show those so that other people, neighbors, recognize that they're there, so that they know that there'll be overshadowing, or they have to have isolation distances for their design. And I'm going to cite Judy Fritz's lot, for example. We had those shown, and their wastewater designer recognized that, and everything was done, and all isolation distances were met. So that's why we also showed that there were soils on both the lot being retained and the lot or the portion of the land being adjusted. One of the things, another significant change was that replacement areas are no longer required as part of the first state wastewater permit. So at that time, we had to show a primary and a replacement. But anyway, so the soils, so we just kind of divided, just made good sense.
Okay. So there's development potential, we're going to end up with one residential development potential on one part of it and 3 on the other. Is that what I'm gathering?
I wrote that into the staff report because if the original, right now, 2 30-acre lots would be, you'd be able to, off of a class 3 road or a rural residential 2, you would be able to each subdivide to create one additional lot, just based on acreage. Obviously, situations on particular lots may or may not allow for such a thing. And obviously, areas with very steep slopes would not be developable. That said, we are required by regulation, on our current regulation, since we went to a density-based system, to actually just simply identify that in the application. If you're fine with that particular split, potential split, not saying that you're going to want to do that, then that's just fine. If you'd like to discuss that in some particular way, by all means.
Future subdivision?
Yeah.
I don't, I personally, it's not appropriate. I mean, it's
Yeah,
just, we're fairly stewardly people. We've owned this for quite 22 years. I have, Bob's probably 18 or 19 years, and it's a part of the, it's the,
Yeah, I think any subdivision in those lots are going to be difficult. But
It's
we're just
not-
going to assign it that particular way.
yeah.
Because per the regulations, we're required to.
But you're letting us know, and,
Yeah.
yeah, that's fine.
So is there intention to actually erase one of the property lines as part of this?
May not show up, but this property line over here is being erased.
Yeah, but when you, are you combining these lots with the other lots or keeping them as separate lots?
So, well, lot 1 is picking up 15.6 acres
Yeah,
to the line that Mitch just highlighted. That line's being dissolved. And the new line is there's still gonna be 3 lots. There's gonna be lot 1, which is gonna be approximately 45 acres.
okay.
There's gonna be lot 2 is gonna stay lot 2, although it's been reduced to about 14.4 acres, I think. And then the big lot is just the big lot, and that's my wife's thing, so, or, that's staying, as is. Well, it's ours, but it's, yeah, there's no proposed changes to that.
So is this a two-step process or just a one-step process?
Just a one-step process. This is a subdivision revision.
Revision.
Unfortunately, if this interior lot line adjustment wasn't part of a previously approved subdivision,
Right.
this would be a zoning, this would be going to, it would have been an administrative, just a zoning permit.
Okay.
Board members have any other questions?
Do that public.
Anybody here from the public about this application?
So these two lots were created when, what year?
Well, there was a revision, there were two, I'll just say based on the final, it went back, I'll say 1990, the lots were created, I think, in 1998, and there was a revision in 1999.
So there was actually a subdivision?
There was. This is one of the first, yes, this was a, yep. As a matter of fact, this is one of the first subdivisions that went through the town of Hinesburg that actually required that state, that the wastewater design met state regulations.
Ah,
Don't remember this, huh, Ted?
Ted was there.
just couldn't place the year.
I would move to close the public hearing and direct staff to draft conditions of approval.
I'd second that.
Any more discussion? All those in favor?
Aye.
Aye. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks.
Very good.
All right, we move on to other business.
We have two draft decisions.
Yep. So I didn't find anything to change in either of them. I can start with United Church. I don't know if any discussion. I didn't have any problem with it.
I guess I just make a comment, just want to be, it is clear that any development of any sort would have to come in front of the DRB?
I think hypothetically, they could make it into a single-family house.
But we said it was for community use, so it
Exactly.
can't.
So being that that's not the case, then it would have to come back.
They aren't allowed to do a single family at this point.
They're not allowed at this point.
Right,
And I
because we
think
said it was for community use.
Right, and I think we tried to cover it. The way the draft decision was written was putting in that requirement, but also trying to give them some leeway so that it could be in all of the ways that you might think of in terms of a community use. If they wanted to make it into a club, or if they wanted to make it into an art studio or something like that, just to try to give them that type of flexibility, but still be of a community type use. I mean, that was the intent. And
Come in front of us and go through all the iterations that need to.
Overkill, so it's kind of nebulous as to whether or not they can repair what's there or have to raise it and start over.
I hope the decision kind of gave them both options.
So, okay, so I apologize because I'm
I mean, unless
totally out of touch on this one. And I haven't read through the whole details, but did you state anywhere that if they do raise and rebuild, that it has to be on exactly the same footprint and of roughly the same structure?
I don't think that would be in the variance, I think that would be in whatever conditional use that they got.
That's assuming they come back for a conditional use
It's
before they
interesting
rebuild
point.
it.
Oh, well, if they rebuild it, they can't change the footprint if it's a rebuild.
All right, let's see, where can we
Well,
put that?
people often,
Why don't we,
go a little over where the footprint was here and whatever.
well, why don't we add something into the order on that, just to, variance, this and the lot.
It's a largely non-complying structure with regard to almost every
Yeah.
setback, so the zoning administrator won't be able to issue a permit for any reconstruction
Yeah.
that changes it in those dimensions.
Right.
And this variance approval doesn't authorize those kinds of changes, so I think it's coming back if it's not gonna be on
Yeah.
the same footprint or smaller.
Because then they would need, in addition to, actually, in essence, another variance, because this variance was, well, in addition to another variance, they would need to come in for expansion of a non-conforming structure. Now, hypothetically, if they knocked it down and made it smaller within that footprint and volume, that may not require an additional variance.
But any new use besides what it's been used for, which is storage, requires a conditional use.
Right.
So
It's pretty well,
I think it's
pretty well buttoned up.
buttoned up myself.
So before any even internal work, a zoning, a building permit, it would have to come to the zoning administrator to grant a building
No, I
permit.
don't think that's true.
No,
No?
if they
Okay.
It's a
were to
permitted
do-
use right now, it's being used as storage, and if this continues to be used as storage, I think they can make internal improvements.
They would need to.
This
get a
variance has
permit
nothing
for
to do with that, actually.
They would need to get a permit if they want to knock it down and rebuild it, pretty much, or rebuild more than 75% of it.
Okay, well, that's the main point. So in that case, the zoning administrator would be able to look at their plans and ensure that they are on the same footprint and they're not, okay.
Yeah, my guess they wouldn't be doing anything major like that unless it's for a new use, because,
You wouldn't think you spend the money to put storage, no.
right.
And they probably would want to come back here to get that particular approval before doing it. But this was written in such a way to try to allow them to, if they wanted to rebuild in kind, and then come back hypothetically.
Okay. Fair enough.
Move to approve as written.
I'll second.
All those in favor?
Aye.
Aye.
Abstain.
How many abstains? Were there four ayes?
A lot of abstains.
Well, you have
Yes,
Dick,
must have
Ted,
4, yeah.
John, actually, I think with John Slason's not here, so you would have Dick, Ted, John, and Brian,
Yeah, that's 4, that's good.
yeah, voting in the affirmative.
Yep. Okay,
Can I ask a question?
sure.
Go ahead.
The abstaining, is that like a common?
They weren't
We
here,
weren't
they
here.
weren't here for the meeting.
I was here, but I was not
You
participating.
were not participating.
I recused myself.
That's true.
So you don't know enough to?
No, I recused myself. I heard the whole meeting.
Oh, okay.
But you,
I even participated.
All right, up next is Mary Provencher.
I also had no problem with this one.
I move to approve as drafted.
Second?
All those in favor?
Aye.
Abstain?
Okay, all right.
All right. Next is the DRB Rules of Procedures. You're just gonna hand that out, or you
I'm
gonna
gonna hand it out, and I'm gonna say, a couple of words of it.
talk? Okay.
If you can just pass that down, and, let's see, 1, 2.
Paper. Uh-oh.
Actually, it's always good,
Not enough.
every once in a while, to just have a chance to review this anyway.
The other side, oh, there.
And, two interesting things that I found reviewing it that I reminded of, you actually have.
Change from.
No change. But basically, one, there's actually a 3-hour time limit on these meetings unless a majority says to actually go further than that. And not only that, just to
Can we
let.
change that?
Well, if you really wanted to.
We did change.
No, can we change it to like an hour and a half?
Another interesting thing, just to let Sarah know that she's on the hook, that if no staff is present, she's the one to do the minutes.
Well, really?
Yeah.
Okay.
We hope never to put you in that situation, but.
It won't look good, but
But basically, it was something that was just requested that we bring out. Some other committee had some issues with it, and I know that's something that this board has, in terms of what I want to say here. Conflicts of interest, ex parte communications, all those different types of things. This board has been doing very well with that, but just administration thought it would be just good to just be able to provide this again and just let you know that, it just is a reminder on all the different things. And like I said, there's some interesting things that are in there. How meetings are to be conducted is actually in there.
Okay.
Is there anything we're consistently doing wrong? I would say no.
No. I mean, if you go through, sometimes there's a little bit of wiggle room on some things, but I think that actually makes the hearings go well, and the important thing is people have their chance to be heard, and the applications are done in a fair way, or as fair as possible. And that's.
It was pretty sensitive to the appearance of impropriety for conflict of interest purposes here.
All right. I'll mention that we were originally thinking of having Haystack hearing at the next meeting, but that they weren't quite ready. There was one part of their application. The application's really coming along very well, but one part that was not quite ready, and we felt it was best if we push them back to a later meeting. And so we'll advise on that. We do have another sketch plan application for next meeting. Interesting one. Donovan and O'Donnell are coming back, and they've pretty much have scrapped what they did before, and they're doing something a lot simpler.
On Mechanicsville?
And it should be very beneficial and something I think that will be good. And that's all I have as far as news and announcements, and we have the water wastewater allocation scoring. And Alex is here.
Alex brought celery and carrots.
And in the box, there are cookies. Wow. So if you want, a 2-minute break, Mr. Chairman, you can avail yourselves of the treats. But knowing you like to get right through things.
Stick right to you.
Okay.
Just bring the box over here.
Yeah, bring the box, pass it around. The tray's harder,
I'll
but
bring
it's
the napkins
healthier.
too, okay?
So, I'm here to talk to you about a planning commission, project that the planning commission has been working on for some time. But it's actually a project that Sarah was a part of before the planning commission got its hooks into it. So, a couple of years ago now, the select board appointed a water and wastewater allocation committee, and it was a special ad hoc committee that had representatives from the DRB, that was Sarah, from the planning commission, from the select board, from the economic development committee, the affordable housing committee,
I got it all in front of you.
and staff. And that committee talked about our current allocation system, and also what our fees are for water and wastewater, and what our capacities are, and what the plans are for the future, with a goal to consider a different way to allocate this precious municipal resource. So that's exposition. The short story is they made a proposal for a more innovative scoring system for water and wastewater allocation. The select board looked at it, thought it looked interesting, didn't commit to doing it, but gave the planning commission direction to actually refine it and then get public input on it. And the planning commission has done that refining and is having a public hearing on February 12th. So I am here to tell you about it and get some feedback and encourage you to give me more feedback in the lead up to the February 12th public hearing, or if you'd like to come, you're welcome to attend, so that the planning commission can revise it some more and tune it up and then ship it off to the select board for them to chew on. It's complicated, there's no doubt about it, and the idea is that if the public thinks that it's a reasonable way to go forward and the planning commission decides to forward something to the select board will need to spend some time looking at both this zoning regulation change, which contemplates this scoring system, as well as several changes to our ordinances that govern allocation that would set up the framework that this scoring system would live within. So there are a couple different moving parts to it, and the part that we're looking for feedback on now is principally just the scoring system.
I guess my question is, based on Wilston's experience, how subjective is the scoring system? I mean, on its face, I've read through it, it seems fairly objective, but my guess is in application, there's a fair bit of subjectivity involved in it.
We had presentations from the Williston town planner, and we looked extensively at their system. Interestingly, in the last year, they updated their system, so they've been using it for a very long time, and they finally got to the point where, like, we've learned some lessons, and here's how we're gonna fix it. And those changes their select board passed. So they talked to us about their system, how it worked, and how they were trying to improve it. My sense of it, Greg, is that their system was actually more subjective in the scoring department than what we've proposed here. The allocation committee and the planning commission wanted it to be as objective as possible, understanding that there will always be some level of subjectivity. So for example, in many of the Williston categories that projects were scored on, they had a range of 0 to 10. You could score 0 points or you could score 10 points. And unlike many of our categories where we gave specific examples and tried to give you a range, they didn't have any of those. It was just, how well did you satisfy this standard, 0 to 10?
And Wilson's only a portion of their development has to
Correct, it's only the residential slice of Williston development that went through their scoring system and their growth management
So
system.
would we anticipate staff reports that would do a preliminary scoring assessment?
Yes, absolutely. So the way the Williston model works is that projects have to get through an initial conceptual level review by a certain date, and then those that make it by that date then get heard a couple months later at a single meeting where the board takes all of the projects that made the cutoff and staff recommends a score. Applicants are able to come in and lobby for, what they think is an appropriate score, and after hearing that, the board decides what the scores
So
are.
can you kind of enlighten me as to how you think the review process is going to be initiated for a project that would
Yeah, so
follow
I think
these
it's,
parameters? It's not going to be a sketch plan, I gather.
So for a subdivision, it will be a sketch plan, and that's the easiest example to picture to paint. So let's say someone comes in and wants to do a 7-lot subdivision, and the first step, as you know, is sketch plan review. They're gonna come in for the same sketch plan review that they've always come in with you, but they're gonna have to have it reviewed by a date certain in order to qualify to be considered for allocation in that fiscal year. So there's gonna be a date deadline that people are gonna be trying to get in by. You guys are gonna be rendering sketch plan decisions. And then after that, maybe a month or two after that, you're gonna be scoring the projects that you've reviewed and have made it in by that critical deadline. So for a subdivision, the system will actually work very similarly to how it does now. Right now, subdivisions within our water and wastewater service area need your sketch plan approval before they can go to the select board and get allocation. That system isn't really gonna change. They're gonna need your sketch plan approval to then get their allocation, which they're gonna get from you, not the select board, at least the scoring side. For non-subdivisions, it will work differently.
So Hannaford, for example,
Yes.
is coming under this.
Correct, and they were
So
not
how
a
might that-
subdivision.
How might that work?
So what would happen in a case like that is that the project would come in for a conceptual level review, like a sketch plan level of detail, not the full-blown site plan review or conditional use review that Hannaford went through. So we're going to need to invent a sketch plan review for non-subdivisions that will provide you enough detail to do the scoring, but not so much as to require an applicant to spend hundreds of thousands of dollars just to demonstrate that they have a project that can get allocation. So there will be a sort of a new beast in the review process for non-subdivisions, a sketch plan like conceptual level review.
Now, would it be hard for some developments to be able to tell you how many jobs they're gonna create and all that at sketch?
Yeah, so the example that we thought was the easiest to understand was the Kinney Drug example. So the developer came in and said, I'd like to do a subdivision. I have an anchor tenant who is interested and wants to be in this subdivision. And I also have a variety of other buildings I'm gonna build as a part of this, and I don't really know who those tenants are yet. In that case, that developer could have come to the board and said, here's my sketch plan. I know how many jobs I'm gonna create with Kinney Drugs. I anticipate several other businesses, and I'm building those buildings on spec, or I'm getting approvals on spec. I don't know what those buildings are gonna require. And so scoring-wise, he could have gotten points for the Kinney Drugs jobs, but no points for any of the other jobs that might have been created in the other buildings. Now, it's in that project, if I remember correctly, allocation wasn't secured for the entire project all at once. Allocation was secured for the portion of the project that was understood. And then as he came back for successive reviews, additional allocation had to be acquired for those buildings. So how we sort of meld that and make that work is gonna be an interesting question, but it's an issue that we've had to deal with in the past.
Yeah, well, if the developer comes in for like phase 1,
Yep.
he only gets allocation for part of it, right?
Well, your input on these things in the past, Sarah's been a big part of this, has been, we want to make sure there's actually going to be allocation for the whole phase, not just the Kinney Drugs portion. And we want you to estimate what allocation you need and demonstrate that you can actually
Right,
get
but
that.
So he has to get so many points to get all that allocation.
Right,
But there's other ways
So
to
if he
do
doesn't
it.
get it,
But,
so he,
but jobs are just one of them.
correct. Jobs
Yeah,
are,
no, I know.
jobs are one category, and in that category, developers will get points if they have a specific business and business plan that they can demonstrate and passes a straight face test. They will not get points for buildings built on speculation. So another example, Wind Energy, Jan Blumstrom, had a independent lot sort of on the corner of Riggs Road and 116, and had submitted a site plan application and was ready to come in to you and withdrew at the last minute due to some issues with state permitting. She had gone to the select board and gotten allocation for that project before coming to apply for you, which is how our regs work for site plan review. You gotta get your allocation first. She went in and got that allocation, and that was a purely speculative project. There were no businesses, lined up. There was just the idea. And so they came in and said, we expect, I think it was 85 jobs and X amount of process water, and we don't have a formal business, but this is what we think the site will support and what we'd like to get allocation for. If she had come in under this proposed system, she would not have gotten any points for job creation, even though a whole bunch of new jobs were anticipated, because there wasn't an actual business or plan. And so she would have had to have gotten points in other ways in order to compete for that allocation.
And there'll be like a one-time-a-year allocation meeting.
Right, that's the idea, is similar to Williston, we would have once a year when you as a board would look at the projects that came in, at the deadline, by the deadline, and the select board would tell you how much allocation you have to give out in that year, and then your scoring would determine who gets it.
so theoretically, someone could get approved for development and have to wait a year?
Depending when,
Yes,
Yeah.
you could get a sketch plan approval from the DRB and then get told, but we don't have allocation for you this year, so you'll have to come back.
or we have it determined, it's passed in, April, and we do the meeting in March, and they would have to wait from April all the way to March to know if
Yes.
they're gonna get the
Yep.
application.
Actually, for any developments, they wouldn't be able to get an approval without the allocation. When you think about a site plan or a preliminary plot, preliminary final plot, they wouldn't be able to get that allocation until, I should say, they wouldn't be able to get the approval until they actually got the allocation.
Right, and so on those projects, again, we would need to create a conceptual level review similar to the subdivision sketch plan review for those projects to go through first. And whether that would be an approval or whether that would be a review, we haven't fleshed it out, but that's something we need to.
And we talked about some
Anticipate.
fast tracking before Ronan was born. Did you guys flesh that out?
Yeah, so the idea, if you're looking at the
I
documents,
bowed
I
out
sent
then.
you there's a 2-page document that talks about ordinance considerations. And in that, we talk about having an opt-out, fast track, whatever you want to call it, off-ramp for smaller projects, so that projects that are below a certain level don't even have to go through this scoring process.
Yeah.
Because the Williston experience is that those small projects have a very hard time competing with the larger projects to get their allocation. And so there needs to be a way for them to get their allocation and move along. So there's that. We did talk about at Sarah's committee's level whether we should have another off-ramp for projects that were just like platinum projects that from a scoring standpoint were off the charts and just were gonna be the best thing that ever happened to Hinesburg. Why should they have to wait? Why should they have to go through the competitive process?
What if we had one of those?
Yeah, I don't know, the NRG project might have been that. But in the end, the committee and the planning commission felt like we don't want to go there. We want everybody to compete except for the small projects that, are gonna have a hard time doing that.
But BlackRock, for example, would not be involved in this ordinance, even if it's passed on a fast-track schedule, would
Not-
it?
Not for their first phase. They already have allocation secured for their first
And what
phase.
about Brett's most recent?
He also has
iteration?
allocation, most of what he needs
So
for
how much,
his
I mean,
first
since
phase.
we're talking about the
How much
municipal service system, how much does this really affect what's out there still?
Yeah, that's
to
a
be
good
developed?
question. The BlackRock project, the portion that they have allocation for, I think is about 2/3 of their overall build-out. So there's another third of that project that doesn't have allocation and could be subject to this. Similarly, the Hinesburg Center project has maybe 2/3 of their allocation yet to get. I think that project was somewhere in the 22 dwelling unit range, and the overall, the rest of the build-out total is 69. So there's a substantial chunk of that project that still needs allocation. Then there's the Blumstrom project, which does have a small amount of allocation, but appears to be in limbo and maybe giving that back. There's also the Quinn property, which has a very substantial build-out potential and has zero allocation. So there is a fair amount of future development that this new system could apply to. But you're right, the first phases of Hinesburg Center and Haystack Crossing are already in the door in that regard.
grandfather passes.
Yeah. Assuming those projects move forward. It's possible those projects may shift, morph, change over time. We'll see what happens on that front.
Is there a usage, if they're only under X amount of gallons of water or sewer, then they don't
That's-
have to go through?
Yeah, that's what's contemplated for this sort of opt-out for small projects. And the committee and the planning commission thought on a subdivision level, maybe we just sync it up with the minor major subdivision differentiation. Minor subdivisions are 3 lots or less. Maybe they don't need to go through this. Major ones, maybe they do.
Depends on how many of them you have.
Well, that's a good point. The idea with this opt-out would be on a project-by-project basis. And so the way Williston works, which is how it would likely work here, is that each year the select board would put the available allocation in pots. And they would say, this is how much the DRB gets to play with through its scoring process this year. This is how much we have for all the other projects, whether they're small opt-out projects or some special municipal project. And once you've met that max for the year, whether you've been through the scoring process or you're a small project, we're done. We're not giving any more away, and you gotta wait until next year. So even small projects that might be exempt from the scoring process, if there were a lot of them, eventually we're gonna run out of allocation in that particular year, and we'll have to say no.
So if 10 was the magic number, and you're number 11, you might have to wait,
Yep.
even though
And
it's a
and that's
small
how the
amount.
Williston model works as well. They give a certain amount of allocation in each year. It's not all of their allocation. They sort of parse it out. And we anticipate that being similar in Hinesburg, that the select board wouldn't say everything that's available is available in this year. That they might look over a 5 or a 10-year period and say, we're gonna chunk it up. All of this depends on us bringing the new well online. I think it was Andrew Frost in our committee meetings from the Economic Development Committee who said, this is a complicated enough system that if we have the amount of allocation we have today, which is very small, it just doesn't make sense to move, to move to this system. I don't want to say if the select board, had made a ruling on that, but I totally agree with Andrew. This is a heavy lift, and there's no reason to do it if we're not going to have substantial capacity to dole out. And the question about whether that well is actually going to provide the water we need won't be answered until probably June.
There's no bartering with that well?
We own it now, so that well is ours. BlackRock helped us drill it, and they turned it over to us, and we need to finish the testing of it to see if it's actually worth bringing online.
Is their allocation based on that well online, or no? They have allocation?
They
what is
have 2
current?
sets of allocation, one set that is secured based on our current capacity. That's phase 1A of their project, and one set, Phase 1B, that's based on that well coming online.
Okay. But they do have something like allocation without that well.
Oh, yeah, yep, just like the Hinesburg Center project and the Jan Blumstrom's project was all from current.
So would that put pressure, I'm sorry, go ahead.
No, go ahead. Yes.
Is that gonna put pressure on us to have to see 4 or 5 possibly applications a night instead? You know what I mean? Cause they're all gonna be wanting to get.
The month before the allocation.
Well, yeah.
Yes,
deadline,
So I think we need to, if we do this, we're gonna have to set up something where,
Yes,
It would be,
absolutely.
there would be like a meeting, I'll assume, like if the allocation is given in June, you figure sometime in July or August, there would be a specific DRB meeting set aside for allocations.
But you're right, in terms of having a deadline and saying you gotta be in the door by this date to be considered, there's gonna be some backup at that date. Now, for reference, in Williston, lots more development happening there than here. In their last year, I think they had 4 applications for their growth management system. So,
big ones must have been though.
some of them, yeah, a couple of them were reasonably big, but I'm just saying numbers-wise, it wasn't an awful lot.
Oh.
Think about how many projects you review within the municipal sewer and water area in Hinesburg. It's not a lot. So I don't think that's gonna be an issue, but I think it's one we should plan for. I think the bigger issue, as Sarah knows, is that we designed this system with the idea of competition is good. And this will help projects try to be the best projects they can be so they can ensure they get their allocation. If we only see 1 or 2 a year, they're not competing with anyone. So I don't know to what extent we're gonna see that competition really happen, but, you know.
Just that segues into the thought I had. Williston's had this model for 20-plus years.
Yeah, I think it's been about
Why are not the 225 other towns in Hinesburg rushing to replicate it?
Yeah, that's a good question.
Well,
So,
but nobody has a fine, I mean, you wouldn't believe what we had to do to search to find anybody that has as much finite resource of water that we have.
yeah, Sarah's committee, everybody divvied up the state, and we contacted a whole bunch of the municipalities that have water and wastewater, municipal water and wastewater, and it was shocking that some of them don't even track it. They just don't have a good sense of where they're at in terms of their capacity, and most of them were not bumping up against the limits of their system, maybe because they weren't tracking it, I don't know, but anyways. And that was echoed from the state, the person at the state who gave us the database to use. He said, you guys are way ahead of the curve in knowing where you're at, planning for the future. I think a lot of communities just, it's not a limiting factor, and so they don't see the need to create a more sophisticated system. I
Do you
will,
think the systems work good in Williston?
Yeah, the only thing, the big thing they were changing was like their look back. Like I don't know what they ended up changing for sure, but what he was, when we had spoken to the person, he was saying the big thing that they were thinking they were gonna change was the way they parsed it out over like 5 years, and there was like, it was a little complex, like the look back and the look forward.
yeah, what Sarah's talking about is when you, a couple things. They meter it out over a 10-year period, but then within any given year, only a certain amount of that 10-year capacity can be allocated. And, you know, bigger projects can use what's available in that year and a percentage of what's available from the next year and the next year, and they do that over like a 3-year rolling thing. So that's complicated. And then on the look back part, when they grant allocations and a project doesn't use them or doesn't use them over a period of years, they wanted to reform how they either get those back or how those projects can build out in the sort of slow growth that's actually happening. So those are some of the tweaks that they made. They also did introduce this sort of super project option where if you have a project that's the platinum project, you get to the front of the line. Actually, you skip the annual scoring, review, and you just get your allocation. So they did a number of things, some of which I think our group felt like, yeah, maybe we would do that too someday, but we're so much smaller than them that we want to sort of keep it simple and take baby steps.
So if there's only one application that meets the size that this falls under, they just win, right?
Yes, there is, in,
How do
But
you,
that's-
how do you know that
There's still a
at the
floor.
time you're, how do you, I mean, if
But
that,
we're
if
still-
that
they're
shows up
still-
in March,
But they're still meeting, I mean, they're still meeting our regulations.
they're meeting
I mean-
regulations, and this scoring system contemplates a minimum score, such that if there was one application only, and it didn't meet the minimum score,
Yeah, but-
it still wouldn't get the
Yeah, but that
allocation.
minimum score is really low.
It is very low, yes.
12 points? That's,
And the planning commission went through several scenarios.
Some of those are hard points that
They're given many points away.
These are above and beyond, generally speaking. So these are above and beyond what the regulations would require in the first place. But it's not, you're not wrong, Ted. The score was set, the minimum score was set on the lowish side so that it was achievable. So yeah,
But right now, if a project meets, the regulations, it's passing.
yeah,
So, I
Yeah,
mean,
it's-
I wouldn't change,
it's important to note that right now, it's a completely first come, first served system. You get a sketch plan approval from this board, or if you're a site plan review, you don't get any approval, you just go to the select board and say, I want it, and you get it.
The big question I have, how do we know how much, we'll say gallons? Do we have 100 gallons to allocate? And
Well-
how do we know? And when will we know?
So the select board will set that annually. Once a year, they will get a report from the utilities department of, here's how much you have available for water and sewer to allocate. And the select board will say, okay, from that, we're gonna put this much in the DRB scoring pot, this much in the small project exempt pot, and this much in some other pot that I haven't
Even though
thought
they
of.
have more capacity than that?
Well, I mean, they could take all of it and just divvy it up amongst those pots, but I don't think so. I think the idea is that they will try to meter it out over a number of years so that projects won't be able to just, take it all in one year.
Right, but if we have to update our system, I'm guessing they're gonna wanna allocate it all, because they're gonna need that.
They're gonna
money.
need the money, yeah,
No, they're gonna need money
yeah,
from the users to pay for it,
yep,
right?
yep, and that'll be part of the select board's
That's
mental
why I don't
calculus.
understand why they're giving it to us.
well, they're not giving it.
Well, it's Sarah's fault. That's what I'm upset. I'm kidding. First of all, we're modeling it on Williston, and Williston they give the scoring responsibility to their development review board. The select board is responsible for knowing how much in any given year is gonna be available within that, DRB scoring system. But the idea is that the board that understands the development ought to be the same board that decides who gets to proceed with those developments. You all understand the developments, and right now, our system is very much a rubber stamp from the select board. They get their approval from you, they go to the select board on a subdivision, and the select board doesn't have any criteria to say no, other than you didn't meet the DRB approval, or you don't meet our design standards for how big a pipe you're gonna put in,
Worried
so.
about was that we could approve a project and they might go to the select board and based on what was available, only approve 50% of the allocation that they needed to approve for our project. So then, and we, you know what I mean, so then you have to go back and start phasing because they only got 50%, but we approved the set sketch plan because we believed that it was a good sketch plan, but then they couldn't get the allocation, you know what I mean? That's the part where there was like a breakdown with them allocating the amount and us approving a plan.
But that could still happen if we theoretically had 4 or 5 projects in front of us.
Yep.
Then you come to the meeting, and then you gotta divvy it up.
You do, and that's a really good question, Dennis, one that I've been thinking about.
Do you divvy it up in phases or you divvy it
Yeah.
up by project?
Unless you remember how much you wanted for the
This
First one that came
isn't well spelled out in this concept, and I think it's a flaw. We need to spell it out.
Close it up.
In my own mind, the projects that scored the highest get first priority, and they get the allocation that they
100%.
need. And if there's any left, the next project gets the allocation it needs, and so on down the line. So that you're not giving 4 projects
Right.
25%
Right, yeah.
each of what they need.
But
You're giving the best project what it needs to move forward.
at the same time.
You are,
And we're not gonna.
we are.
Well, you might see one project in March, another project in
voting on.
No, you're gonna see them all and you're voting voting once a year on all the projects that you saw that whole year.
Right.
That's the
Well,
whole
what you-
point, you
well,
have
what
to
you
see
will
them
see.
all once. You can't,
So we don't actually do the site reviews, the sketch reviews until the following year?
No, you don't do the scoring for the allocation purposes until the following year. So if we said, everyone who wants to be considered in this fiscal year for allocation has to have their application in and heard by the DRB by December 31st. And then we tell people, everybody who made that December 31st deadline, come back to us in March, because in the first meeting in March, we're gonna look at all those applications that came in, and we're gonna score them and decide who gets their allocation. So that is the, yes, there's a little delay so that you can assess all the projects that came in the prior
We can't do
year.
a sketch plan approval unless we're convinced there's water available.
No, actually, that's the difference. Right now, you don't look at water and wastewater capacity in your sketch plan review. That's not part of your sketch plan review. That comes with preliminary or final.
No, you're thinking, all right, for sketch plan.
Right, for a subdivision,
But
they
for site
don't
plan, it's
have to
different.
address water or wastewater at the sketch plan level. All they have to do is say, I'm gonna go get it. The town has some, I'm gonna go get it. And in fact, they can't get that allocation until you give them sketch plan approval in the current system. So that.
We did deny some sketch plans because we didn't think there was enough water to do it.
It wasn't a sketch plan, it was a,
It's preliminary when
No.
actually, or final, that actually has to come into it. The issue is really site plan approvals, where people who are interested in doing a site plan, well, it's gonna happen one of two ways. People who are interested in doing a site plan approval is gonna have to come before they actually come in for site plan to be able to get that particular allocation, that scoring, get that approval before actually then coming back for a site plan review. And, but it's not gonna change much in terms of subdivision, because they'll have to get a sketch plan approval and then come back for a preliminary or final on that.
Which could be a project by at least a year.
Yeah, that's my question.
Could be.
So the
It could be.
developer
I mean,
comes-
so you're that brewery that you want to come into town, or you're a brewery that's in town and you want to expand, you can't expand until the end of the year when everything has been parsed out.
unless you're,
Right, so it depends when you apply. So let's say the deadline for having the DRB adjudicate your sketch plan was December 31st. If you had your bright idea about your brewery expansion in October, and you got on a November meeting, and you get then everything is gonna flow normally. But if you had your idea in January, and then you're right, you'd have to wait a year.
Business doesn't work that way.
I know, and that's one of the
It's not
issues.
necessarily when you got the idea, it's when you have the money to be able to go
Right.
forward with the idea.
So for a subdivision, I don't think it changes much because, as Mitch would tell you, and as you all know, the time lag between seeing somebody at sketch plan and then coming back for the next phase of preliminary or final tends to be a year anyway. You know how our sketch plan approvals are good for 6 months, and we frequently you have to grant extensions because people aren't ready in 6 months. I don't see a whole lot of problem on the subdivision side. I am totally agreeing with you on the business side. That is a flaw. That is a problem. And Williston doesn't have this problem because their system only applies to residential development. So it's not even relevant to them.
So why aren't we doing it?
We're gonna need to talk about that, actually.
Like a mid-year commercial review sort of?
Yeah, I mean, one solution would be have more than one review a year,
or that could
Because they
be
get a lot
a
of different
pot,
projects than we do.
or it could be a different pot.
And it's like, oh, we think we're
and
gonna
we
do
could
10 jobs,
raise
but,
that,
you know, we're only doing
non-residential,
5.
gallons per day.
I think there are a number of solutions to it, but I think Dick is highlighting a flaw that we need to fix in this proposed system. Now, the reason we're not doing it, or at least it wasn't initially proposed, is that Sarah's committee and the planning commission felt like all projects ought to compete, and the criteria were set up so that non-residential projects would have scoring potential, and residential projects would have scoring potential, different categories for each. And they could all sort of compete with each other. But I agree with Dick. I think that the way business works, and especially expansion of existing businesses, that time horizon is gonna be
It's
problematic.
bringing in mixed use in new businesses, you know what I mean? Mm-hmm. It's not like the cheese plant where they had the existing building and then they wanted to bring something in.
Right.
Those people would have had to wait a year,
Up to.
Up to, right.
up to.
It depends when they made their application, but yeah.
Unless-
Or even if they wanted to
unless their
expand.
initial- Or unless their initial.
You know what I mean? If they wanted to expand, they need to hire more people and they need to expand their sewer, they would have,
Yep,
yeah, that would be an issue, I think.
If a
Well, I agree.
pre-existing business has water allocation and they do want to expand, would they supersede because they're already here?
so I suggested that in some of our conversations, and the response was, no, everybody ought to compete on the same playing field. So the answer is, if what new allocation you need is big enough to trip the system, then you're in it, and you have to go through the same process as a new project.
But there's a very good chance that when you were developing your project, you asked for the adequate allocation and you could just, it's already accounted for.
That was
See,
my-
here at the cheese plant, they didn't know what businesses were coming in.
That was my
I mean,
next
like a milk
question.
plant,
Is there a
whatever
way
takes a lot of
to,
allocation, I would think.
is there a way
I mean,
to
they've never
like
been given
buy
more allocation, right?
allocation?
They've only
Because you think you're gonna have a bigger business?
The brewery got a whole bunch
So
of
I think I'm
additional
gonna
allocation, didn't they?
I don't think
Use
so. I think they use
80%
a lot
of that
less
100
water than-
gallons,
Yeah,
so I
that's
wanna,
Well,
here's my plan.
Yeah, so to answer your question and speak to what Dick was just saying at the same time, Foam Brewery, who's in the cheese plant, came to the select board and said, we wanna get allocation for our new operation, and we anticipate ramping up over a period of years, and we wanna make sure that the allocation we need in year 3 doesn't go away in the meantime. So I think I'm remembering this right, they bought that larger amount of allocation, and they worked out some agreement that the payment for the use of it would happen when they brought it online. So they paid a certain amount, reserved it, and then when they were ready to use it, which they were just in the last, I don't know, year and a half, cut the town a big check to sort of turn on the rest of the allocation that they had been given. So there are ways to get after that, but yeah, this issue about the speed in which new businesses or even expansion of existing businesses need to make those calls, get their financing, secure deals, it could be a problem, you
To
know.
cut to the chase, Alex, we as a DRB are not being asked to pass on the wisdom or non-wisdom of this proposal. I, as one DRB member, am happy to work with whatever system the Planning Commission works out. And all of these concerns are interesting policy proposals that should be put before the Planning Commission, and I'm sure they will be. But we don't have to ultimately tonight decide on the ultimate wisdom or lack of wisdom of this proposal.
What I would say is, don't feel like you have to fix the problems you're identifying tonight, but hearing the problems that you're seeing is helpful. But yes, maybe even more helpful would be your feedback on what you think of the scoring system, how logistically, whether that makes sense to you, whether the criteria that are listed in it, in that 8-page document are specific enough.
I think it's a lot better than a free-form Williston type system, and if there are problems in application, they can be tweaked over time. So just reacting to what's on paper, I was positive to that. I think those are criteria that we can work with.
I think a big wild card here is we don't know how much we're gonna give away,
Right.
give out a year. I mean, if it's not very much, you might create competition, bigger projects might have to wait, assuming you can roll allocation over to the next year and the next year. I mean, if you need to build, I don't know, 30 housing units, what do you have to wait, 4, 5, 6 years till you get enough allocation in order to build those? Right, I mean, that's kind of what Williston ran into, so they let you pull it all up front, kind of mortgaging your future years to do them all up front, right? And that was the biggest change that they saw, and you were identifying some maybe bigger projects that might happen in Hinesburg, and then are you you know, it's tough to put a brand new road infrastructure in and then wait for your allocation for years, right? So
Yep.
I think a big piece of it is how much allocation do we have a year, and obviously, we don't know that yet.
Yeah, we
so.
just don't. Dennis has been harping on that on the planning commission for years now. Like, we need to know what the number is. We need to know what our capacity is, and we just don't.
Well,
Right.
at some point, public know or possible applicants know that if I come to Hinesburg, I know they have the 100 gallons to work with, or will they not know?
They will.
They will,
Yeah,
at
yeah,
some point.
absolutely. I've been, I've been wanting for a long time for this to be resolved, just our capacity issues, so that we could put that out there publicly, like Hinesburg's open for business, and here's what we have to work with. You know, we do have municipal water and sewer. Right now, it's hard to have those conversations with prospective applicants because we
So
have
if a
to.
business needs 11 gallons and Hinesburg only has 10, then they're not even gonna come.
Right,
But they shouldn't be able to know that.
right, yeah, we want that information to be on the table.
And there was one year, like I think it was not last year, the year before, where literally they came out and said, we have zero allocation.
Right. This was when we were having such bad leaks within the existing system that the department was chasing those leaks and just didn't feel comfortable giving out any allocation. That was a difficult
Yeah.
6 months to a year for us to have conversations with potential
So
applicants.
the wells were drilled a year ago. Why is it taking so long to determine whether they're actually provable?
Yeah, so I'm not gonna throw anybody under the bus, but the legal negotiations with, between the town and BlackRock took a long time, in terms of how much capacity they were gonna be assured and who was gonna pay for what. So that took a long time, and.
Yeah, that was my question.
And the testing, the testing is rigorous with these new public water supplies, and so we've done lots of preliminary tests, but the key test, so we know that it's potable and, you know, is likely to pass on that regard in terms of contaminants, there's no issues there, but, at least as far as I know. But the key test that we're waiting on is the drawdown test, where that new well is pumped hard for 5 to 7 days, and all the surrounding wells are monitored to see how their static levels drop or don't drop.
Is that a seasonal test too?
It is, so I had hoped that we were gonna do that this last fall, and unfortunately, the legal harangue took long enough that when we finally got able to do it, I was told, yeah, it can't really happen during this time of year, we gotta wait till the ground thaws and we can get out there again and the pumps will work properly and all of that jazz. So that's why that drawdown test is scheduled for late spring. That's why I'm saying we probably won't know until May or June. But that's the key test, because if we do that test and the 2 wells that are currently serving our municipal water system, which are just to the north, go dry, then the new well is sucking from the same water source and it's useless.
Right.
All the preliminary tests that we've done say that's not gonna happen. Like they have some comfort level that this is a good well and it's not gonna run interference with the surrounding ones, but we won't know 100% for sure until we do the formal test. And that takes time and seasonality and, yeah.
Is the well to the north, the Wayner property, is that finalized with what it produces?
Yeah, but
Yes, those
we,
were-
remember we took the other ones offline, so it didn't really give us net much more,
So,
right?
yeah, so it used to be the 2 wells behind,
Right.
you know, here that was served our system. We drilled 2 new wells up on the Wayner property, took these 2 old ones offline, and yeah, those 2 on the Wayner property have been running for a couple of years now, and we know what their capacity is. Yep.
What about wastewater?
Wastewater, good question. So water is the short-term limiting factor for sure. Wastewater, we have actually a lot to give away. I think we're at maybe 60% of the plant's capacity. But
Need to make improvements, I heard.
we need a big improvement, yes, because of the Lake Champlain cleanup. The state is compelling us to hit lower phosphorus and nitrogen discharge levels, and we can't do it with the current plant. Just the technology, the lagoon technology can't make that happen. So from a capacity standpoint, we have a fair amount of capacity, and the state surprisingly is gonna allow us to give out more allocation, even though we haven't upgraded the plant yet. because we're planning to upgrade the plant. So it's not so much capacity on the wastewater side, it is the need to basically build a brand-new wastewater treatment facility. And we have a clock to do that with the state.
What is that?
Yeah, it was 5 years from when our permit was reissued, which I think was in 2018. So, yeah, I think we're looking at 2023. And in order to hit that mark, we really wanted to go to the voters in March with a bond to pay for a new system. And the select board tomorrow night is talking about whether to delay that vote until November.
What is the bond for?
The amount?
Yeah.
11.7 million.
Yeah.
And so select board was hoping that we would be eligible for USDA rural development funds to at least provide us, what was this, $3 to $5 million, I think was the range in grant funds, so that would, reduce the amount we'd have to borrow. And it turns out we're not eligible for that based on the income survey that was done. So, yeah, we're potentially on the hook for a very large price tag.
What happens if we don't do it in that time?
Good question. So the worst case scenario is that the state, who has an agreement with the EPA, US EPA, would impose fines that would be enough to make that wastewater treatment plant happen.
So might as well build it because you're going to pay for it.
Right,
anyway.
that's the worst case scenario. I think the best case scenario is we would continue working with the state and saying, we're making progress, we're doing the best we can. We have a fiscal issue here and we need more help from the Clean Water Fund or from a federal, allocation or something, and get an extension.
If you didn't add any more sewer to it, would it still be 11 million to fix it?
Yeah.
So that's a good question. We are exceeding our phosphorus discharge level and, more importantly, our nitrogen level today with our current discharge, current capacity, who's on the system now. So even if we didn't do the full-blown improvement, we'd have to do something. And those somethings are going to be very similar, if not the same, as the $11.7 million option. The lagoon-based system just does not treat nitrogen or ammonia, and that's the treatment facility we have is a 4-bay lagoon system. So it's going to be a major upgrade, no matter what. Even if we were somehow able to wheel and deal our way with phosphorus on another treatment plant. Like, let's say somehow we could get the state to agree that we would pay South Burlington to get some of their phosphorus capacity or to improve their discharge because they can do it more cheaply than we can. We'd still be stuck with this ammonia treatment issue, which is actually related more to the La Platte River than it is to Lake Champlain. And we're still stuck with a very large price tag.
Geographically, is it still okay where it is? They can redo it right there?
Another good question. So we had soil analysis
I have some
done,
land for rent.
and unfortunately, the soils are bad, and the systems that we're contemplating require fixed piping that can't move. So they anticipate over the life of the system, 50 years, that site where we'd be installing the new equipment could settle as much as 2 feet, given the existing soils. So it's a bad spot, actually. And we looked at alternative locations with more stable soils and didn't come up with any that were going to be cheaper. And so the proposal, part of the $11.7 million, about, I can't remember if it's 1.5 or 3 million of that is stabilizing those poor soils through.
Engineering.
Yeah, you can drive piles or you can drain those soils with a wicking system, and the wicking system is the one that we're looking at.
How many users do we have on the system right now?
It's about 500, so we have a bit more on the water system than we do on the wastewater system, but the wastewater system, it's a little under 500.
Divided, 11.7 million divided by 500.
No, I divided 1.5 million by 40,000.
That's less than my replacement.
Because everybody
septic
could have
system.
their own little mound system.
Yeah, unfortunately,
300 people there.
the densities that we have here in the village are such that there's just no way to do on-site septic. Not just the densities, the soils, yeah. So we're stuck between a rock and a hard place. In relationship to this allocation scoring system, it's another one of those, when are we gonna pull the trigger on this? If we pull the trigger on this new allocation system, when is it worth it? You know, we have some questions to answer before I think we know whether it's really worth it to move to what is arguably a more complicated, more sophisticated allocation process.
Town could have a big bond hanging over their head, and we could be restricted on how much we can sell, right? How much allocation we could sell.
Yeah, although I think Dennis is right. I think if the bond were to somehow pass and we made these upgrades, I think there'd be a big incentive on the part of the select board to make a good chunk of that allocation available sooner rather than later. The more users on the system, the easier it is to spread those costs around. But that's an important, and I don't want to go too far afield because I appreciate Greg's point, like, you know, there's only so much policy that we can talk about. It's important for the community to know that we're gonna have to make these wastewater upgrades regardless of whether we add a single another house to the system. So new users on this, new users that your board approves through new development are not gonna drive the need for this. They're gonna help us with the pay it off.
Yeah, for sure.
Yeah.
Alex, that was very informative, thank you.
Yeah,
Sure.
thank you.
So again, February 12th, this was really just to get your juices flowing. Thanks for the feedback you did provide. If you have thoughts ahead of that, let me know and I'll bring them, or let Dennis know and he'll bring them to the planning commission hearing. And I'm happy to take them by email or just give me a call or any way you want to submit feedback to this scoring system.
And if you only have my email, just send it to me and I'll forward it.
Did we miss out on that grant by a lot?
I don't know, I actually am curious and I want to ask Renee and Joy how that worked, but all I know is it didn't pan out, so. Heinsberg as a whole doesn't pan out when it comes to USDA rural development funds because our median income is too high. And so even though we're not a rich community, certainly by Chittenden County standards, by the state standards, we are. So we don't get.
Well, I should retire and knock that down a little bit.
So I was gonna say,
It's the town benefit cliff.
Are you skewing our data?
Get a couple more
Grab Karen.
$1 million
Move to
bonds
adjourn.
and we'll fix that
Second.
income
Thanks, Alex.
issue.
all those in favor?
Destroy your work.
Yeah.